Hi, welcome to part one of the Bible study of where is Jesus in the Old Testament. And that question, even on the surface, it can kind of feel like a trick question because there are those who would say Jesus can't be found in the Old Testament. That's kind of ridiculous. And then there are others who say, yes, we can absolutely find. And then there are people like in between of, well, maybe we can, or maybe there are things that kind of describe who we understand Jesus of the New Testament to be. And so what gets said, like where do we find these things? And so first we're going to look at the Gospels before we actually go into the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures. And in the New Testament, we actually find a couple of passages that people look at and go, see, this is where we need to be paying attention to. Jesus is in the Old Testament. So starting in Luke 24, verse 27, it says, then he interpreted for them the things written about himself in all the scriptures, starting with Moses and going through all the prophets. And you go, oh, okay, here's a reference. And Jesus is talking about himself and he's talking about Moses. And when we hear the word Moses, what we're talking about there is the Torah, which includes Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But here's the other thing to know about that. So those are attributed to Moses, but they weren't necessarily written by Moses. But when we hear that, it's like, okay, we can go search in those places. But does Jesus go any further? Does he mention anything else? And the answer is no. And what's also interesting, that this is getting said after the resurrection. And so to begin to think about that, of going, all right, this is said after the resurrection. This is said on the road to Emmaus, and sitting down and having a meal. And so to think about, all right, how does this begin to work? How do we understand this working in Genesis and through the different prophets up through? And is there anywhere else in the New Testament, anywhere else in the Gospels that may give us another clue? All right, so we get to John 1, verses 1 through 5. I recommend reading that whole chapter. But we get in these few verses, it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Word was with God in the beginning. Everything came into being through the Word, and without the Word, nothing came into being. What came into being through the Word was life, and the life was the light for all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness doesn't extinguish the light. So right there, John, which is one of the last, it is the last, we think, of the Gospels that are to be written, and it's written almost getting closer to the 2nd century. But to think about here that this is a creation story, and this is talking about Jesus was there at creation. And so it's making a very particular statement. And you go, okay, well, if Jesus was there at creation, where do we begin to find that? And how do we begin to maybe even understand that? What does that exactly mean? Can we find that in the creation story? But before we get to Genesis, we can look at John 5, 45 through 47, where again, these are words that are attributed to Jesus that say, don't think that I will accuse you before the Father. Your accuser is Moses, the one in whom your hope rests. If you believed Moses, you would believe me because Moses wrote about me. If you don't believe the writings of Moses, how will you believe my words? So right there, Jesus is saying, hey, Moses wrote about me. And again, even in the Gospels, it's not said, well, where? Like which writings? Like which book? Like, can we find that? And so when we're looking to that, we can find in Genesis 1, 25 through 27, because this has the early Christians. Those sayings have the early Christians going, we're going to go look for that. Where can we find that? And so in Genesis 1, 25 through 27, it says this: God made every kind of wildlife, every kind of livestock, and every kind of creature that crawls on the ground. God saw how good it was. Then God said, let us make humanity in our image to resemble us so that they may take charge of the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the livestock, all the earth, and all the crawling things on the earth. God created humanity in God's own image. In the divine image, God created them, male and female. God created them. So right there, especially in verse 26, we hear, then God said, let us, plural, let us make humanity in our, again, plural, image to resemble us so that they may take charge. Us, plural. And so the question becomes, well, who is with God? So early Christians go, oh, that must be what Jesus means when Moses wrote about me. So that's how some people can interpret that. Doesn't mean you have to, but that is one of the interpretations of how you can understand where, all right, people are looking to the Old Testament of going, all right, is Jesus here? The other one can be found in Daniel. Now, Daniel is not part of the prophets. We are going to we'll get into the prophets in November and December and read the places that often by the early church get connected to Jesus. But today we're going to look at Daniel because it's part of the writings. There is some debate. Some want to debate that Daniel is a prophet, while it is not grouped that way in Jewish writings. But to think about, all right, what is this trying to say? So the verse, you could read the whole 3rd chapter. It's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They get thrown into the fiery furnace. It's a fascinating story. But the verse that we're looking at is verse 25 of chapter 3. It says, he replied, look, I see 4 men unbound walking around inside the fire, and they aren't hurt. And the 4th one looks like one of the gods. Well, now that's fascinating. That's very interesting to say. And the 4th one looks like one of the gods. They threw 3 people in, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and now there's a 4th. And so that gets interpreted. If you were to read through the rest of chapter 3, you would know that it talks about angels. But some have said, let's just overarching, we're going to go with the presence of God is with them. We don't totally understand it, the presence of God. Others go, oh, like here's another instance of there's something going on we don't recognize, we know it's associated with God, and so some early Christians go, oh, maybe that's Jesus. And so to just recognize that this is some of the ways that Scripture gets interpreted, especially by the early church, early Christians who are trying to understand, all right, how is Jesus connected throughout history? And we may think, well, that's kind of ridiculous, but to recognize how important it is at different points to go, no, the story is connected. Like there's a way that the entirety of the Bible is connected, and here are some of the ways that individuals will connect them. And so what's the purpose for us? Like why should this matter to us? Well, one is it can be kind of cool to think about and to be challenged by it of, okay, well, who do we understand Jesus to be? And how do we understand Jesus showing up in the particular time and place? And are there other ways that Jesus shows up throughout history? And so it kind of can give us a sense of curiosity and exploration, but of also understanding there's multiple ways to interpret and understand Scripture that sometimes can be helpful for some people. Sometimes those ways are not helpful for others, but it gives us a sense of, okay, we're kind of growing in knowledge and kind of understanding where people are coming from and why people are trying to connect in different ways. And so I hope that just kind of helps as we explore these. And like I said, November and December, we're going to get into, all right, where are the connections to the prophets that people have made throughout history? And may you know that God goes with you, that God has gone with you that your entire life, that God goes with us throughout history in numerous ways so that we will all know that we are loved. Have a good one.